Hello, everyone. We're gonna take just about a minute. We have some people coming in. My name is Christina, and I am the Office Manager and Communications Coordinator for the Melissa Institute. And I would like to welcome all of you to the next installment of the Innovations in Violence Prevention and Treatment series. This time, we teamed up with Dr. Annette Greca to bring you a course called Impact of Disasters on Youth, Building Resilience in Children and Families. We are excited to have Dr. LaGreca with us and truly feel that there's so much that you will take away from what she has to share. A few things before we start. Just keep letting people in. There we go. In the email that you received yesterday, there was a link with materials for you to review and use during the presentation. I am putting that link in the chat once again, so you could be able to access it easily. If you have any questions for Dr. LaGreca during the presentation, please just drop them in the chat and she will get them answered as we go. We will have some poll questions as well and a survey popping up throughout the course and would love your feedback. And also please remember, if you requested CEUs, you are required to fill out the post-training survey, and I will post that in the chat towards the end of the session. Thank you again for joining us, and I would like to now pass the stage over to Executive Director of the Melissa Institute, Dr. Etione Alderando.
Good morning, all. It's a pleasure for me to be with you today. I'm Etione Alderando, the Executive Director of the Melissa Institute for Violence Prevention and Treatment. For those of you who are not familiar with or are new to our family, let me let you know that for more than 26 years now, we have been at the forefront of in the use of science for the prevention and treatment of violence and the promotion of mental health and at home and in schools and communities. Whether it is addressing interpersonal violence, bullying, human trafficking, or the impact of trauma in children and adults, our training, resources, courses, and interventions are designed to prevent violence, build resilience, and promote safer communities through education and the application of research-based knowledge, which is why we're here today. I'm a firm believer in the power of gratitude and want to express my gratitude to Christina for helping in organizing this presentation. I also want to express my gratitude to Pastor Kahian for reaching out to us with a distress call following Ian hurricane. To remind us basically the purpose of our work and to invite us to think out loud and how to be of use and help to the community of Cape Coral. And so I want to thank you. She's in the audience right now, and we hope to continue working with them as they into the next year. This presentation in part was motivated by that initial phone call, and I'm very grateful to Annette for agreeing in on the spot to kind of like join us and said, yes, I'm there. I'll be a resource for you and the community. So here we are today, and today this leads us to the talk by Annette LaGreca, which is, you have her bio, and you know that she's a distinguished professor of psychology and pediatrics at UM. She has a number of awards to her name. The most recent one is as a lifetime career award that she might be able to tell you the full name of the organization, but it's a long international organization. But she's an extraordinarily accomplished scholar and who has dedicated her work in part to work with youth on risk and resilience issues on youth and developing strategies for promoting resilience of among youth, including the impact of natural disasters on children and the families and the psychological well-being of all of them. She studied youth and families risk and resilience following the Hurricane Andrew, Charlie, Irma, and is the author of After the Storm, which you received a link to download. And if you haven't done it yet, please do so, because she will be using it as a resource for this in this presentation. I am Annette, in debt for you for being so generous with your knowledge and time, and I'll leave it up to you now Thank you.
Well, thank you for this wonderful introduction, Etione. I'm really delighted to be here. I think we got it now. Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be here today, and thank you all for coming. And I thought, as Etione mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Miami, and I'm also a clinical trial psychologist. I've been working in the mental health field with children and adolescents for my whole career, and I am really delighted to be here. And I thought, before we get started, it would be really helpful for me to get an idea of who's in the audience. And so I think Christina has a quick poll for you all in terms of your professional background. Yeah, just so that I have an idea of like what your background is and maybe can tailor some of my comments more appropriately. So if you've got your trusty. Okay, so I can see we've got a number, about half of the people responding are psychologists or school psychologists, a little bit more licensed social workers, survivors, and community leaders. Great. Okay, so I see many of you have a mental health background, so this will be especially useful, I think, in that regard. So let me share the results so you can see who's here as well. Okay. And we've got a few who've already survived a natural disaster. So that's also, I'll be really interested in your input. So let me close this up. So let's get rolling here. So as Etione mentioned, my work started with Hurricane Andrew. So I've been studying hurricanes now for quite a long time, over 30 years. And if for those of you who are not from Miami or who, and if you had not experienced Hurricane Andrew, it was like one of the first Category 5 hurricanes to strike the United States. And as you can see, this is the satellite image of it the day before it struck landfall in South Florida. And so you can see how large the storm was. And it was a very fast moving storm. It caused, because of that, tremendous destruction. So this is one of many pictures from the Miami Herald that was taken at that time. But Hurricane Andrew affected a 400 square mile area in South Florida, from basically the Kendall area down to Homestead. And people who lived particularly in mobile homes and less stable structures were really completely demolished if they lived in that area. But since Hurricane Andrew, I've gone on to study a number of other hurricanes, including Hurricane Charlie in Southwest Florida, which struck in 2004. That hurricane in particular, that was a Category 4 hurricane, but what was remarkable about that one, and for those of you who have experienced Ian might relate to this as well, but it was initially projected to hit the Tampa Bay area, and it was only a few hours before it made landfall that the storm curved and instead really squarely hit Charlotte County on the southwest coast and caused tremendous destruction there. So you can see on the picture on the left, the car on top of what was left of a house, palm trees destroyed. And, this is what kids' neighborhoods look like for a long while. It was hard to go out and play. There was a lot of debris everywhere. I also studied children's reactions after Hurricane Ike, which struck Galveston, Texas in 2008. And that particular hurricane, in addition to windstorm, had a lot of flooding and other kinds of destruction. More recently, I've studied Hurricane Irma's impact. 2007 was a banner year for hurricanes. It was Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And although it missed South Florida area, we had Hurricane Irma caused a huge evacuation throughout the state of Florida. But what's remarkable is that we're having more and more of these destructive storms. So actually 2020 was a banner year for billion-dollar climate-related disasters in the US. And 2021, last year, was hot on its heels with $20 billion weather and climate disasters. And you can see, almost every part of the country is affected by some climate-related disaster. Clearly, the Southeast has a lot of hurricanes and a lot of tornadoes and severe storms in the Midwest, but fires and severe drought in the West. This year, for example, we've had the Great Lakes. This is the Great Salt Lake in Utah on the left, and you can see it's not really a Great Lake at this point because of severe drought conditions, which also were linked with some severe fires that took place in the West. And unfortunately, these kind of climate change weather events are not just even limited to the United States, but they're all around the world. So this past summer, Europe experienced its hottest record heat ever. There were tremendous droughts. This is a picture from Spain. And Australia, on the other hand, had record-breaking floods. So a lot of disasters worldwide. And then most especially here in Florida recently, I imagine maybe some of you are here from the West Coast of Florida, but have maybe experienced or are working with children or families in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian. As you can see, some of those pictures were pretty devastating and showing the kind of destruction that was experienced and is probably ongoing there for quite a while. So what can I say about this? I mean, disaster exposure is unfortunately on the rise. If you look at the data from the World Health Organization, they estimate that disasters affect about 175 million children worldwide annually. And because of climate change, which is bringing about more extreme weather, this is anticipated to increase over time. In particular, climate change is bringing more strong storms, like more strong hurricanes and tornadoes, more flooding and extreme rain, more severe winter storms, which, by the way, turn out to be the most, the climate event that's most associated with death and loss of life. It also brings about severe droughts and wildfires. And because of this, I think, as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, preparation and recovery become very, very critical. Now, I don't know if Christina can bring up a quick poll here, but I was wondering how many of you might have either experienced a hurricane or an evacuation event. So if you wouldn't mind just filling out this poll, I'm just curious to see how many of you might have had some experience in this regard. Okay, so we've got a lot of people. So far, it's looking okay. End poll. Okay, so it looks like we've got quite a few people about half who have experienced or evacuated a hurricane, and most of you are reporting that you've experienced a hurricane. So I think you'll find that some of this is consistent with your. Hopefully, you'll find it's consistent with some of your experiences. So. All right. So to give you an overview, the way I have this talk organized, the first half is really more of a review of what we know about risk and resilience and intervention from the research literature on children and disasters. And then we're going to take a brief break, and then I'm going to walk you through the After the Storm manual, which provides a lot of ideas for how you can intervene and help children cope with the aftermath of these events. So starting with this first half, I'm going to be covering what is a disaster or traumatic event, how do we define that? And then following that, lessons we've learned from previous disasters. And it's roughly divided into three areas: youth's reactions to disaster, what some of the mental health impacts are, and risk and resilience factors. And then near the end, we're going to talk about strategies for intervention and best practices. So starting with the first theme, nature of disasters, what they share in common is that they threaten one's sense of personal safety or that of their loved ones, of your loved ones. They're often frightening and out of the realm of usual experience. But one of the things that I didn't really fully appreciate until Hurricane Andrew was that they disrupt your everyday life, both in the short term and often in the long term. So for example, this is a photo essay that the New York Times did 1 year after Hurricane Katrina struck in Louisiana and the Mississippi Gulf Coast in 2005. And you can see, this wasn't even in New Orleans, this was in somewhere along the Gulf Coast. And you can see that this child's life was nowhere near normal 1 year after the storm. And I think this is important to realize because these more destructive disasters take a long while to recover, but they're no longer covered in the media. People don't really appreciate how people are still struggling over a long period of time. And I know that was true, certainly for me, which took 2 years to get my house back together after Hurricane Andrew. But people thought, well, are you still worried about that? It does take a long while for people to recover. So let's move into the kind of lessons learned that I have organized into those three categories. First, on youth's reactions. The first thing I would say is that post-traumatic stress is the most commonly studied reaction among youth. And for those of you who might not be familiar with post-traumatic stress, these are the key symptoms of it as it's defined right now in the what's called the DSM-5. Most of you are familiar with the DSM-5 and Diagnostics Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. But a key symptom, which children report very frequently, are re-experiencing symptoms, things like having bad dreams or intrusive thoughts about the event. They can't get it out of their mind. A second set of symptoms could be described as avoidance, where you avoid cues, or they could be internal cues like memories or feelings, or external cues, places or activities that remind you of the event. For example, one of the children we interviewed several years after Hurricane Andrew told us that he still avoided going into his living room because when Hurricane Andrew struck, his living room was totally destroyed and they had to replace all the furniture. And every time he goes into the living room and he sees the new furniture, it still reminded him of the event. Arousal is another symptom cluster that you see with post-traumatic stress. And that means things like being hypervigilant, like worried about another event coming, or insomnia, having trouble sleeping, poor concentration. I've underlined these symptoms because with children, those symptoms also greatly interfere with their academic functioning. And the last symptom cluster have to do with how you think about things and your mood. So negative beliefs about the future, anhedonia, feeling like you can't feel your emotions, you feel estranged from other people, and also risk-taking behaviors fall into this cluster. This cluster you see most especially with adolescents and adults. It's really hard to define some of these in younger children, but those are very common symptoms in adolescents and even adults. But we find that post-traumatic stress, as important as it is not the only reaction that you can observe among children after these events. So, for example, we can see that youth's mental health reactions to disasters in the psychological distress area. You see symptoms of acute stress in the immediate aftermath, which over time is post-traumatic stress, which may take a little while to develop. We also commonly see children reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression. In addition, especially if there's a significant loss of life, you see grief reactions, substance use, particularly in adolescents and adults, suicide and suicidal ideation, again, more especially in adults, and even stress-related health problems. Here, especially, you see sleep loss and somatic symptoms occurring. And in addition to the fact that there are these other symptoms, many youth report multiple problems at the same time. So here's some findings we had from the Bay District schools. This was a school district in northern Florida that we surveyed 6 months after Hurricane Michael, which was occurred in the fall of 2018. So this is in the spring of 2019. And the pie represents all the youth in that sample who reported elevated levels of post-traumatic stress. And you can see that a quarter of those, 25%, also reported elevated symptoms of depression. And more than half the sample reported elevations in post-traumatic stress and anxiety and depression, all three. So clearly coexisting symptoms of anxiety and depression with post-traumatic stress are fairly common. Very few, only 16% reported only elevations in post-traumatic stress. So that brings us to the next lesson, which not only are co-occurring symptoms of distress common, but they predict poor recovery. And I have a more complicated slide I want to walk you through here, but this is after Hurricane Ike. And we assessed children after Hurricane Ike in Galveston, Texas at 8 months and 15 months post-disaster. And on the bottom here, you can see we assigned children to groups based on that 8-month time one assessment. And we had one group who had elevations in both post-traumatic stress and depression, another with post-traumatic stress only, another with elevations in depression only, and then those who had neither. And you can see that if you look at the kids who now at time 2 had recovered, had no post-traumatic stress or depression, that was only about 30% of the comorbid group, but more than 2/3 of the group who only had post-traumatic stress or only had depression. So the kids with both had a recovery rate that was less than half of what the others with elevations had. Another way of looking at this is to look at how many kids remained elevated and post-traumatic stress and depression. And 1/3 of those who started off at 8 months continued to have elevations in both areas at 15 months post-disaster. But this was significantly lower in those who only had post-traumatic stress elevations or only had depression elevations. So really the bottom line here is kids who have co-occurring symptoms are going to be among those who are slower to recover and who may need more help early on. So again, in terms of kids' reactions, our next lesson is that they affect children's physical health as well as their mental health. And this is really basically a fairly understudied area of the impact of disasters, but it's an important one because stress plays a role in how disease develops. It also suppresses your immune system. I mean, many of us know this also from COVID, but stress can also disrupt one's daily life, your diet, your exercise, your routine, and that can interfere with good health practices as well. So for example, after Hurricane Ike, these are some photos I took in the neighborhoods in Galveston 8 months after Hurricane Ike. You could see it still didn't look great. It still wasn't really particularly a safe area for kids to go out and play in afterwards. And so, you know, one of the things we found, I'm going to show you this graph first on the right, but this is from one of our publications after Hurricane Ike. But basically what it's showing is, it's a path diagram showing that the life threat and perceived actual life threat during the storm and the recovery stressors, things that happened in the aftermath, contributed to children's post-traumatic stress symptoms. And for those kids who had post-traumatic stress symptoms, they also had higher rates of sedentary activity after the storm. Now, we think this is because the kids who are more stressed also lived in areas where they couldn't engage in outdoor physical activities. And quite frankly, schools after these events are often having trouble continuing with instruction because kids may have missed school because of the cleanup and the recovery period right after the storm. And one of the things they first do is they remove recess, they remove gym, they remove the play activities in favor of beefing up some of the academic activities. So kids are getting a lot less physical activity. You know, but some other reasons why disasters could contribute to these kinds of poor health is because of things like interrupting your normal rules and routines, and healthy eating may go out the window for a while. I don't know about many of you, but my favorite comfort foods are pasta and gelato, which are probably not the best things to survive on in the long term if you're trying to stay healthy and strong. So the final thing in terms of children's reactions that I want to make a point of is that they affect children and youth much more than adults realize. And just as one illustration, I'll show you from one of our studies, we looked at, on the left, parent reports of children's post-traumatic stress after Hurricane Charlie, 9 months after the disaster. And here's the parent report of their child's distress and their own distress. And here's the child's independent report of their own distress. And you can see that they're really not correlated at all. Now, maybe I could pause here and ask you to think about that for a second. Why do you think a parent would be not very much in tune with their child's level of post-traumatic stress? I don't know if you can pop a poll into here, Christina. I'm just curious what people might think.
For the polls, it is not a freehand, but if they can type their answers in the chat, that would be great.
Okay, let me pull up the chat. I don't have the chat here. What are some, right, it's not a poll, right? So what are some, if you just drop it in the chat, what do you think, why would parents be so out of tune with kids, do you think? Their own PTSD. Lack of parent coping skills. Okay, so I see lack of parent coping skills. They don't recognize the symptoms. The parent's own post-traumatic stress, dealing with stressors of getting back into their schedule and routine, don't want to accept the symptoms. I think that's a very interesting point. Or thinking that the child may not be being able to comprehend what's going on. Urgent need to focus on surviving. I think you've all hit it like really right on the head there. I think parents are unaware, in part because they're so preoccupied with trying to get everything back to normal, and I don't think they want to believe that their kids are having bad reactions. Parents themselves are often preoccupied. I have a recent picture from Hurricane. This is a picture from Hurricane Harvey, but mothers, are especially protective of their kids, and they don't want to believe that something's wrong, and they also have their own things going on. I would say when we interviewed kids after Hurricane Andrew, a lot of them told us that it's also the child too. The child is seeing that the parent is distressed and not wanting to bother them or trouble them even more. Because a lot of kids told us that they hadn't told their parents that they were this distressed because they could see that their parents were also really trying hard to cope with things. So one of the things that this brings us to is one of the implications of this section here on children's reactions is that mental health assessment should really evaluate children directly, if at all possible, because parents, teachers, other adults may not be aware of how severely the child may be reacting to the events, or may not know what to really look for. And the children may not be sharing it with them. Another point I think from this section is it's really important to assess mental health reactions broadly, not just post-traumatic stress, because as you can see, those other reactions really matter a lot as well. And the third point I want to make is that adults, like parents and teachers or counselors, people who care for children after these events, are also stressed. And so adult self-care will be important. It's kind of like the message that you get when you're on an airplane, the safety message at the beginning, where when the masks fall down, if you're a parent, put it on yourself before you put it on your child. In order to be able to take care of your child, you're also going to have to be able to take care of yourself. And that's a message that we like to convey to all the adults who are providing care for children after these events. So I have put a pause in here in case there are questions at this point. I don't know if any of you have questions that you want to raise about children's reactions. Maybe you can just type them in the chat. I just opened up the chat on my screen. Any questions at this point, or otherwise I'll move on. Okay, let me move on. Is there anything psychologists can do? Well, yeah, we're going to get to preparation. I will come back to that later. So, and there are other opportunities to ask questions as we go through. So let me get back to this. Now I want to talk about children's risk and resilience after these events. Okay, one of the things the good news in all this is that most youth are resilient and they do recover over time, even if they have a rough period at the beginning. So to illustrate this is some data we had from Hurricane Andrew and children's disaster reactions. And you can see we assessed children 3 months, 7 months, and then 10 months, the end of the school year after Hurricane Andrew. And what we found, which actually was quite shocking to us, because again, teachers and parents told us our kids are okay, but we found that 38% of the sample reported symptoms that were consistent with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder at 3 months post-hurricane. And quite a few had moderate to severe post-traumatic stress symptoms there, you can see as well. The good news is that by the end of the school year, that had declined significantly, but still 18% still reported symptoms almost a year after Hurricane Andrew that were consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. Oops, here we go. So earlier, did I skip something? Here, hold on. No, yeah, I did, sorry. So what's significant about the kids who don't recover by 10 months is that we're also with further research finding that the kids who don't recover by 9 to 12 months, roughly in that age range, time range, post-disaster, probably have persistent post-traumatic stress. And I can illustrate this with the data we had from Hurricane Charlie. So for example, here on the left, in Hurricane Charlie, our first assessment occurred about 9 months after the hurricane. And then we reassessed children 1 year later. And at 9 months after the hurricane, a third of the sample reported moderate to very severe levels of post-traumatic stress. And a year later, that had only declined to 26%. So clearly still a significant number, and more or less the same kids were reporting substantial post-traumatic stress now more than a year after the hurricane. And in fact, when we went in the schools, I was a little worried that kids at 21 months post-disaster wouldn't remember Hurricane Charlie. And so as a prompt before we asked kids to fill out surveys, I asked, do you guys remember Hurricane Charlie? We're going to ask about Hurricane Charlie. And one kid raised his hand and said, oh yeah, I remember Hurricane Charlie. It was the worst day of my life. So these things really can stay with kids for a long time. So because of this, some kids not recovering, we started to look at early risk factors that predict which youth recover versus which youth remain distressed, because then we can target mental health resources to those kids who are really going to be most at risk for persistent reactions early on. I'm going to walk you through this model here. It looks a little complicated, but I'm going to break it down into 3 sections. But this is the risk and resilience model we use to look at how kids react to and cope with these traumatic events like hurricanes. The first component is what happens even before the hurricane or the disaster event. What kind of characteristics does a child have? Here we find these characteristics may put children at more risk. Girls report more post-traumatic stress and reactions than boys, though the magnitude of the difference is not great, but girls tend to report more of these stress events, stress reactions. Younger children more so than adolescents. Minority youth, probably because their areas and the areas that they live in, and low-income youth, areas that they may have less insurance and may be harder for them to recover. Their areas may be more seriously affected by the destruction involved in these storms. We also find that youth who are anxious even before a hurricane are the event magnifies their anxiety and contributes to post-traumatic stress. Children with prior trauma exposure can also be more sensitive. And this means other kinds of trauma exposure too, like kids with a history of abuse, neglect, or other kinds of traumatic events may also be more vulnerable after these disasters. And also youth with special needs, kids with learning problems, autism spectrum disorders, all of those youth may be more at risk after because of all the disruption and chaos that goes on with these events. So that's what happens before the event that may put a kid at risk. But what happens during the event, and now we're finding even immediately before the event, can put a youth at risk too. So for many years, the disaster literature has looked at what kind of exposure does the person have to the event, and how is that linked to their stress reactions. And exposure has been defined mostly in terms of life threat and loss and disruption. In the life threat area, what we mean by that is you have at least the perception that your life is in danger. There doesn't actually have to be loss of life for you to perceive your life is in danger. So for example, you're staying at home. I had friends who during Andrew spent the night in the bathroom with a mattress over their head. And while their house was being, somewhat destroyed by the hurricane, none of them actually lost their lives or got injured, but they were pretty scared and they were fearful for their life. Another aspect of life threat is actually if you see injury or harm to yourself or to a loved one, and certainly death of a loved one would bring the perception of life threat. But a point I want to make about loss of life threat is not necessary to perceive that your life is threatening, is that this is also true in the COVID pandemic. I mean, we saw, especially early on, all the flags, all the memorials to the escalating death rate among Americans. And it wasn't hard to perceive that your life was being threatened, even if you didn't come in direct contact with COVID. So one of the more recent areas that I've been working in is on the pre-storm preparation and evacuation preparation. And in that area, we're now finding, based on our data from Hurricane Irma, that one can perceive life threat even before a disaster strikes. And I think the media does a lot actually to this. So for example, on the slide here on the left, you see, I showed you Hurricane Andrew previously as it was coming to South Florida. And this was the comparison that was promoted in the news media between Irma and Andrew. And it was a terrifying comparison because it was a much larger storm and it was heading Category 5, heading right for Florida. And this is true, I think, for hurricanes, but for any of you who work in potentially in other disaster areas, it's also true for fires and floods, like the fires, that mass evacuation in Lake Tahoe last year for the fires that occurred in that area. Well, what our work is showing now on evacuation experiences is that they are very stressful for parents, and they happen in the immediate preceding week before a disaster. Trouble with transportation, not knowing where to go. Some of the things parents reported were trouble making decisions about whether to stay or whether to leave, getting stuck in a lot of traffic, having disagreements with family members about what to bring or leave behind. And notably, this happened especially among people who evacuated, but even some among people who wound up sheltering in place. One of the other things we found was that evacuation experiences were highly stressful. So those who evacuated reported considerable stress both before and after the storm because they then had to try and figure out how to get back to their home. Those residing in mandatory evacuation zones also report a lot of stress before the storm, though not so much after. And finally, this evacuation stress we found to be predictive of post-traumatic stress symptoms, both in parents and in youth. This is now 4 months or so after Hurricane Irma. And so, I just have a couple of tables here, but on the left, you can see table 3. It's showing the predictors of post-traumatic stress among parents in our sample. And there's a significant effect for evacuation experiences before the storm, even when you control for a hurricane, whether they actually even had hurricane exposure or other kinds of things that we know contribute to post-traumatic stress. And the same was true for children. Before the storm evacuation contributed to their reports of post-traumatic stress, even controlling for other aspects of exposure. So I guess what this is saying is that exposure is not just during the storm, but it's immediately preceding the storm as well. So the other element of disaster exposure is the loss and disruption that ensues afterwards. And so here's some examples from Hurricane Andrew. This is what kids had to go through. 61% of the kids in our sample said their home was badly damaged or destroyed, or their clothes were and toys were ruined. It was hard to see friends, trouble getting food or water, having to move to a new place or having to go to a new school. I mean, some of the schools couldn't reopen after Andrew. They were completely destroyed. In fact, one school became a school for two schools. So they took one of the schools that was destroyed, and those kids came in the morning from 7 to 12, and the homeschool, their kids came in from 12:30 to 5:30. So any one of these things can be stressful for a child, but after these events, they may have to endure multiple examples of disaster exposure. Here's an example in children's own words. We asked children, what were the worst things that happened to you because of the hurricane? And you can see children reported, I had to move away. My uncle lost his house. My turtle died of a heart attack. A lot of kids lost their pets, which was really devastating to many kids. Or the ceiling fell on me. I had to go to a new school. I lost a lot of toys. That I lost everything, that we lost our home. And here's another thing that happens to kids, and that we had to leave my mom and dad for about 3 or 4 months, presumably while their house was being rebuilt. So the loss and disruption can be something that ensues for a very, very long time. So that's the exposure piece. Finally, in this model, what happens during the recovery period is very important. So, and in fact, over time, what's going on in the recovery period takes on even more importance than the actual disaster exposure. What's important about this recovery piece is because this is going to give you a clue or cue as to what to do to help kids recover. And so what I like to look at here are modifiable risk factors, things that you can potentially do something about. And here we look at how the family is functioning, what other kinds of ongoing life events occur, what kind of social support does the child have, and also how is the child specifically coping with the event. So for example, with family functioning, if the parents are adjusting well, the children are going to do so much better. If it's a family where there's a lot of conflict, it's going to be very hard. What about intervening life events? What else is going on in the child's life? There may be other major events which could or maybe not even be related to the disaster or hurricane. So, for example, the parents get separated or divorced. There's an illness or death in the family. Children who have those kind of serious major life events that occur while they're trying to recover have a very hard time recovering from the disaster. The availability of social support is critical. And for kids, this means, are they getting any support from family, from friends, from classmates, from teachers as well? Unfortunately, many of those sources of support are also affected by the hurricane, and also may have been further compromised by COVID if it's a recent hurricane like with Hurricane Ian. So, but trying to find ways to build social support is critical. Finally, another predictor of stress reactions is how children cope with these events. And here we don't find that there's any magic bullet in terms of positive coping. All sorts of positive coping strategies can be useful. But what we find is that children who cope with things in a way that suggests poor emotion regulation are the ones who have a harder time recovering. And that would be kids who a poor emotion regulation might be yelling at others, blaming yourself or others, getting really irritable. Those are poor strategies for coping with these kinds of events. So what do we do with this? Well, George Bonato, a number of years ago, tried to reframe the whole disaster area by suggesting that we should be looking not just at how kids are doing at one point in time, but what's their trajectory or patterns of recovery after an event. And with adults, he identified 4 different patterns that you see after these events. One is the elevated one, the severe or chronic pattern of post-traumatic stress. Another is one where you start off still pretty high, but recover over time. A third trajectory is one where you start off maybe not so high, but you show more a reaction over time, which he called the delayed trajectory. And finally, the lowest one, or the resilient one, or this could also be people who don't have that much exposure, but the individuals who show little to no reactions or stress over time. Now, one of the things I'll say, so one of the things we want to do, especially with kids, and we're trying to do, is differentiate. If we can know early on which kids are going to recover and which kids are not, we can put our limited resources towards the kids who are going to be more likely to stay chronic over time, because you don't have enough resources after these events to really individually help all the kids who are distressed. So this is the area that we're focusing on. One other thing I should say about this pattern is we don't in children see that many children who start off low and then get more stressed over time. This delayed pattern tends to be very infrequent in children, and even in adults tends to be more likely to be observed in those who are first responders, police, medical personnel, disaster personnel, because initially they have to kind of keep things together, but then over time their reactions become more apparent. So back to this, how do we differentiate the chronic and the recovering kids early on? Well, we took a look at this after we reanalyzed our hurricane data from Hurricane Andrew data once we had as more sophisticated statistical procedures became available. And what we found was with our sample, we found that we had only 3 trajectories: the chronic, the recovering, and the resilient trajectory. And you can see that really the vast majority of kids fit the recovering or the resilient trajectories. Only about a quarter of the kids, or less than a quarter, a fifth of the kids had a chronic trajectory. And if you look at the kids who were initially elevated, really 2/3 of them recovered over time. So again, this just highlights why it's important to try and identify the likely chronic and persistent kids early on, because they're going to need more help. So looking at our analyses, and this may be a little complicated, but just concentrate on the orange bars on the right. But with our analysis, we were able to look at the odds ratio of being in this chronic group versus the recovering group. And you can see that the factors that differentiated those two groups, which we know about fairly early on, are: one, the chronic kids were much more likely, had higher odds of being anxious generally. This again speaks to the anxious kids being more resistant to recovery over time. Also, the chronic kids had much lower odds of having social support, but higher odds of having major life events occur, and higher odds of using blame and anger strategies to cope with these events. So this is telling you what we need to do early on, particularly maybe helping the kids who are anxious, helping the kids who lack social support, helping the kids who are having ongoing life events that are maybe interfering with their recovery, and also getting kids to focus away from blame and anger kinds of coping strategies and using other alternative positive events. So in general, I think the implications here are that we want to promote resilience by building social support and social connections, improve strategies for coping with stress, help children regulate their feelings of anxiety, depression, and stress, and especially to support positive family functioning and cohesion. Now, before I move on to intervention, I think this might be also another point to stop and maybe take questions. I'm going to open my copy of the chat here to see if any of you have questions here. Okay, we've got a couple. Feel free to put them in the chat. There are a couple that that came in while I was talking. So one is from Nancy. Thank you, Nancy. Sometimes adults feel ill-equipped to explain to their children during the hurricane that the bump, bump, bump against the door are bodies. Ooh, how do you handle difficult questions in the moment? Wow, that's a good one. I think difficult questions in the moment, I think if it's during a hurricane, I think the best thing to do for that would be to just remind the child that they're with you and you're trying your best to keep them safe and trying to distract them from the noise. I don't know. We're going to talk about strategies later for coping, and maybe you can bring that up again, Nancy, if you don't feel like the question is still adequately addressed when we talk about talking to kids, reassuring kids, and also trying to distract them from things that may be distressing. Those strategies may help in the short run. Was the decline in PTSD symptoms without treatment? That's a great question. When we did the Hurricane Andrew study, we could not control what kinds of treatment children might get, just because a lot of support was offered in the schools, and we did take a measurement of whether kids did receive treatment or not, and we couldn't link treatment specifically to declines in post-traumatic stress symptoms. But I would say there are so many ways that people try to help kids after the disaster that it was really impossible to know how much the efforts that people might have made at that time made a difference. It's actually a very, very challenging area to research because of all that goes on that you have a little input or control over after these events, and also just all the chaos that goes on. All right, so no more questions at this point. So let's move on. Oh, wait, okay. When you are a community leader with youth that have experienced major life events on top of the disaster, how do you promote collective community growth and resiliency? That's a great question. I think if you're a community leader, I think maybe one thing you can do is let's again come back to this after we go through the things that help most kids, because I think the things that help most kids are things that community leaders may want to see if they could incorporate into community activities. They're going to be things like trying to maintain normal routines, helping kids get good exercise, outdoor air, like restoring parks and community in the community for kids to have connections with other kids, which they need for social support, but also some physical activity and exercise, which can go a long way in reducing stress. But let's come back to that, Lauren, when we talk about strategies a little bit more. Okay, let me move on to the final part of this section of the presentation. Let me check my time here. Okay, so we need to move on a little bit. Okay, so how does this all translate into intervention? Well, one thing I would say is how you intervene often depends on the phase of disaster that you're in. And to illustrate this, I'm going to give you a typical disaster timeline, though it can vary a little bit depending on the disaster. But so you have a disaster, and this is the time since disaster. So first we have the impact, which is the hurricane in this case. And we want to look at the immediate thing is helping people to feel safe, physically safe, secure, and to normalize their everyday existence. This may take a while to do, especially if the hurricane or disaster was very destructive. But then as you move into the recovery phase, which I would imagine would be true, for example, now in Hurricane Ian, hopefully people are now in housing, they're relocated, the schools are open. Now you start to attend more to mental health needs. And here psychoeducational materials can be very helpful to parents, to school counselors, to people providing mental health services. Also watchful waiting. This would be like looking at the kids who are at risk for poor reactions. How are they doing? They seem to be doing okay? And if not, you may need to have some selected interventions for the kids who are starting to show problems that are not going away. By late recovery, which could be that 9 or 10-month period after a disaster, by that time, kids who are showing problems are going to need more intensive interventions for chronic distress. So the way I like to look at this is in a prevention intervention model, where initially we have level 1 interventions, which are immediately after one of these events, and the entire population that's affected might benefit from them. Level 2 could be subgroups with risk factors. This would be now moving into that early recovery period. Which kids are not recovering? Who are the kids who had the risk factors? How are they doing? maybe some selected interventions for that group. And then finally, the level 3 would be now 9 months or a year later, high-risk individuals are not likely to recover, are going to need more intensive indicated interventions. Excuse me. Okay. So level 1 interventions can reach a wide audience, as I said. And what they should focus on is attention to immediate needs for safety and security, providing psychoed materials that can normalize the event for individuals, promoting social support and social connection, and also providing self-care for caregivers. That's the level 1 piece. And examples of this would be, if you can go to psychological first aid. I have an illustration coming up in the next slide, but if you go to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is nctsn.org, they have a tremendous amount of materials that are available for you to help with an aftermath of these kind of disasters. There are other psychoeducational materials and fact sheets that they also publish on their website. We're also going to spend some time today on the manuals that I've developed with Scott 7 to help children and youth cope post-trauma. And those are always available on serendipity.com as well as on my faculty website. But to give you some illustrations, I don't know how many of you may be familiar with psychological first aid, but this is a really good tool to have in your toolbox. And it's also available as a download from iTunes, but it focuses on, and also available through the VA's website, mobile.va.gov. But it's a immediate post-intervention that focuses on safety, social connection, and self-care. This is an illustration from one of the pages from the Child Traumatic Stress Network, which gives you an idea of some of the resources that are available to you there. So they also have the psychological first aid manual, which is translated into multiple languages, by the way. And they have a version that's available for schools. They also have, if you look on the right, they have a mobile, you can link to the mobile app there. And this is great for, and maybe helpful getting back to the question that was raised earlier about what to say to a child during an event. But there's also this very useful mobile app for helping kids cope. This is what it looks like if you download it. It's really intended for parents, but basically they can take a look at what the disaster is. But so you can click on hurricanes, for example, and it'll coach you through how you can talk to your kids before, during, and after a hurricane. This is great. It's available from iTunes, and you can use it on a phone or an iPad. And it helps parents to, or even others, to know how to talk to children about various disasters. We're going to spend a little bit of time on today is the manual that I've developed with Scott 7 called After the Storm, which is a guide to help children cope with the psychological effects of hurricanes, which we also have translated into Spanish. This was something that we developed as it happened in 2005, right before Hurricane Katrina struck. So it has been used in many, many hurricanes, including Katrina and Rita, and many since then. And we derived it from another manual that we had developed after September 11th called Helping America Cope. But now between the Helping America Cope, After the Storm, and now we have also a COVID version of it, which has many based on the same principles of trauma, relief, and recovery, resilience and recovery. We've estimated that about 40 million copies of these materials have been distributed either through the internet or through printing. So it's been very widely distributed. But here, the manual has things that are appropriate for level 1 and for level 2. And for the level 1 part, the universal part, these are the things that help most children in the aftermath of storms. One is setting up communication with the child, knowing how to talk to the child. So there's examples in the manual about how to do that. Another aspect is promoting positive coping, as I suggested, moving away from negative strategies, poor emotion regulation strategies, to positive coping strategies, maintaining normal roles and routines. Kids feel much better when they're in a normal routine. They feel like their life is normal, and it gives them a more predictable day-to-day experience. So that's an important part of recovery. Keeping healthy and fit, as I mentioned earlier, is important for handling stress. Reducing or limiting media exposure. This is another area that, or in social media or TV or internet, the more you view the stress of what's going on with these disaster events, the higher children and adults' stress levels are. So limiting media viewing to what you need to get out of it, especially before a storm, you can just view what you need to stay safe and then turn it off, because it really interferes with recovery. Staying socially connected is important. Maintaining, and we're going to go through all of this in after break. Maintaining a positive outlook is another thing that helps to combat stress, and also relaxation. Now, I know the question was asked earlier about community. So in the community, what can you do? Well, I think community leaders might try to look for ways that they can help promote staying healthy and fit. As I mentioned, exercise, making the parks or areas, making sure there are recreational activities available for kids that can promote social connection with other kids and also keep them safe and out of harm's way. And, things that maybe volunteer activities in the community, or another way of building on positive outlook, helping others, gratitude. Maybe those could be avenues for communities to come together and help others, and also have a benefit for those who get engaged or involved in those activities. We're going to go through this in the manual, but basically this is just an illustration of what we mean by positive coping, some of the strategies on the left versus unhelpful coping that you want to get kids to move away from. Again, also emphasizing social connectedness, which we're going to get back to again. So the level 2 interventions are ones that focus on those who already have risk factors. And here, there again, in the Helping Children Cope manual, there's a section on these kinds of strategies and areas. But things like coping with fears and worries, some kids, especially the anxious kids, are going to continue perhaps to have significant fears and worries that may need attention. Some kids are going to be coping with sadness and loss, especially if their life has been very disrupted or if there's a loved one that they've lost. Some kids are going to be irritable and they need strategies for coping with their angry feelings. So some of this can be done on an individual level with psychologists, social workers, groups in the schools, but there also are school-based interventions that can help support these kinds of ways of coping. So again, we're going to take a look at this in the After the Storm manual, but there's strategies for helping kids cope with their fears and worries, like helping them develop what we call a worry buster plan. And also in our manual, we have to alert adults, parents, but those of you who are mental health providers already know many of these symptoms, but we also want to help alert parents to what some of the signs are. I think somebody mentioned earlier that parents may not be aware of what some of the signs are of kids' distress. And so in the manual, we also try to alert parents to what some signs of depression are in kids, in case their child is coping with sadness and loss and may need some help. For those of you who work with or in schools, a really great intervention is the school-based cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in the schools. And the CBITS program has its own website, and you can get training in that area, but it's a cognitive behavioral intervention that can be used in schools, and it can be used either for group or individual intervention. And it's really, as it says at the bottom, it's designed to reduce symptoms of post-traumatic stress, depression, and behavioral problems, but also to improve, because of that, to improve children's academic functioning, their grades and attendance, and parent support and coping skills. So this is one I would recommend, especially if you're working with schools, would recommend you check out. And then level 3 interventions are for youth with the persistent chronic problems. These are the kids who haven't recovered by the end of the year. And here, the best evidence we have is trauma-focused CBT, which is the first line of psychological, the literature would show that that's the first line of intervention on an individual or small group basis for kids who show persistent post-traumatic stress. However, I did a review of that literature a few years ago, and I believe in the chat, there's a link to a box folder that has a copy of not only the After the Storm manual, but also a chapter that I prepared with Brianne Danzy on interventions for post-traumatic stress after disasters. And one of the things we found was that if the child has high levels of comorbid depression or ongoing stressors or low social support, particularly from parents, they may need additional strategies to complement the trauma-focused CBT. And finally, the last lesson for this section of the presentation is I think we need to pay more attention to pre-disaster preparation and pre-disaster stress management, because it can help people get off on the right foot when these disasters occur. So now going back to that disaster timeline that I showed you before, we have to pay more attention to preparation. This is something I've actually been advocating for over 20 years, but it's been hard to get people to hear anything about preparation because people don't want to think these things are even going to ever happen to them. But I think now with climate change, we're at a point where people are more interested in preparation. And I really hope that this will be the case. One of the things with pre-disaster preparation is that the news really can do a lot to scare people as well as prepare them. They're trying to make them anxious so that they prepare. But for some people, that anxiety may be ineffective and may be counterproductive. So what we're looking at now is how can we best help children navigate the pre-disaster stress before the storm? One of them is by having people early on talk about these evacuation or need for evacuation and develop a family disaster plan should they need, especially if they live in a mandatory evacuation zone, and improve family communication about these events. But also we're working to try and use some of these same mental health strategies that are great for stress management to move them to the period before the storm even occurs, like reducing media exposure before the storm and providing other distractions. So, just in closing, I want to say my current work and research in this area is moving toward more of the before the storm preparation. And I'm working on a before the storm manual that's going to focus on hurricanes, but also other disasters like floods and fires to better prepare parents and children to help keep them safe, but also to use some of the more effective stress management tools that we have. And then also working on how to best deliver or disseminate this information, because quite frankly, there's already a lot of information out on the internet, and it's almost overwhelming if you're a parent or a mental health worker to try and figure out what to use. So we're hoping to make more sense of this area moving forward. So just in closing, I mean, these are just some shots from the Miami Herald back from the Hurricane Andrew. But, we know that these events terribly affect children and families. They're vulnerable populations after the storm. And so I'm so happy that all of you are interested in learning about this more and trying to share your skills with others who need help in this area. And just in closing, I always like to express my gratitude for my many collaborators in some of this work, and also thank you for paying attention to the conversation today. So maybe we can end this here and maybe move. Let me do a stop share for a second and move more to the entertain any questions you have now before we take a little bit of a break. Let me see if I can find the chat. Any of you have questions? Anything you'd like to raise?
Annette, first of all, thank you very much for this incredible presentation, and so really incredibly valuable information. We have Diana Formosa from NOLA.
Okay.
And she wanted to share some thoughts with you.
Okay. Hi, Annette. I have wonderful examples of community level responses. Yeah, I'm happy. Yeah. I don't know, Diana, can you share them with the group now as well as with me, or how can we do that?
Christina, you're in mute.
So, and people who responded, Susan, who responded to Surfside, yeah, those strategies would apply as well. I think that was also a very traumatic event, and I'm sure shares some similarities to what people are seeing with hurricanes and other kind of natural disasters. So there
Sorry,
we go.
I didn't want to disrupt, but I think I went to with our university, with Nova, we participated in 3 medical mission trips to rural areas of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria.
Uh-huh.
And they were week-long trips, several months apart. And I was just really, really impressed with the sort of role of community centers in promoting kind of community level resilience and community level sort of messages of resilience. And so I think those were the take-home messages that I came back to the US with. So the recovery events were very community focused. They were largely organized out of very small community centers and out of churches. And so there was an example of this tiny church that with community volunteers managed, because no one had power for almost a year in these areas, managed to feed almost 700 people a day out of this tiny little church kitchen. And I remember I was speaking to the priest, and I said, how on earth, right, did you do this, along with some of the community volunteers? And he said, in this town, if we can do it, we do it. And if we can't do it, we do it anyway. And so in Utuado, I don't know if it's possible for me to share my screen, but I have just a couple of photos they created like a community. It's not a memorial. It wasn't a memorial to people who had passed. It was a community sort of like little area with messages of resilience. So it was Puerto Rican flags. And then it was like these hand painted signs that would say things like, smile so that everyone will know that we are stronger today than we were yesterday. Just sort of these, the water bottles that were handed out that said, there's no hurricane that will hold us back. Right. And
Diana, you can share your screen now. I think we made you a co-host. So
let me see. I just wanted to show you, it's very quick. So can you see it?
Yeah, looks great.
So let me see if I can make it a little bigger. That's security alerting. So here are some of the signs that I was sort of telling you about. And then here's, kind of some of the others. They're in Spanish, but it's sort of the community came together to sort of build these things. And it was sort of this context for gathering, but also for sharing these messages of hope. That I think were wonderful. And then when we spoke to people and we just sort of said, after sort of hearing their stories, okay, what's getting you through? What gets you through? The number one answer that came back, again, in these areas was faith and linked to not just community services, sort of community-based services, but also these links to churches. And so there were just these really wonderful examples of things that folks weren't going to come to a psychologist, right? But they would go to this sort of community level clinic that had been open just post the hurricane. We were there for the grand opening, and it was this small area that used to be an agricultural processing area, and they turned it into sort of this community clinic where folks would gather to see the doctors, and then having been there as psychologists, the doctors would sort of send people our way. So anyway, I was so impressed with the people of Puerto Rico. I couldn't resist the temptation to kind of share some of their strengths and some of the ways that they coped with the group.
Well, that's great, Diana. And I think one of the things that it hits on is by doing the sense of community after, and probably could be even done before, but by doing it after, it's sort of like an extension of social support. Like it helps people feel connected. It feels you feel like you're not in it alone. There are other people going through this with you, and I think that is really incredibly potent in terms of recovery. So those are great examples. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure. And thank you for your work that so informed our approach when we went there. We used all of it.
Oh, thank
Thanks
you,
for
Diana.
that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So I see somebody put in a comment in the chat about integrating individual and community work from along the entire process, from pre-event to recovery. I think that would be great. I mean, I think the community, I think keeping a positive frame on things, and like we're all in it together, like, excuse me, doing like more to even disseminate like some preparation materials that can be done on a community basis. Like, maybe for example, like developing a family disaster plan. Like if you want to encourage people to do that, maybe communities can facilitate that, like near the beginning of the hurricane season, disseminating material, maybe even having like the community center sponsoring like a gathering to help them prepare. I mean, I think we could be working more to build community and individual linkages so that it isn't all done on an individual level or a community alone without kind of integrating them in some way. I think that would be great. So,
You have Don has a question.
okay.
Annette, just two items. One is a woman named Fiona Walsh has written a book on resilience in the aftermath of disaster and various ways communities come to play. The other is Ron Howard did a documentary called Rebuilding Paradise, which is a movie in which the town of Paradise was completely burned out in California. And he documents in a rather interesting way in the recovery process. So if you're not familiar with those two items, and your audience, then those are both worthwhile. The other comment that I have is, at least in the study of adults by myself and others, we've enumerated, the kind of algorithm that people need that characterize those who don't recover, as compared to the 75% who go on to become resilient. And I wonder if those same processes apply to children, so that the degree to which they keep their distress a secret and don't share it with others, the degree to which they ruminate and dwell on it, the degree to which they see themselves continually vulnerable. So I wonder if the parameters that I highlight in the Roadmap to Resilience book would be applicable to children as you see it.
I certainly think they would be. I mean, certainly the rumination, and continuing to think about that. It sounds like that would be very applicable to children.
Yeah, and I think it would be interesting if schools in Florida required every child to bring in and discuss with their parents what the evacuation plans would be. What would be their preparation? I think schools could take a real initiative and have bottom up. You could have all kids sort of interview their parents. What were the lessons? What did we learn from, that kind of initiative?
Yeah, I think schools are a great way of getting people on board because they reach a very diverse population, and what's nice about schools is like, the beginning of the hurricane season comes at the end of the school year. I mean, that could be an easy thing to build into like make it more of a fun end of the year activity that everybody engages in, or at the beginning of the school year when we begin the peak of the hurricane season. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of room for building in more pre-disaster preparation on community and school level. I think it's important. I think we're in a environment now that people are more receptive to doing preparation for these things than they have been in the past. So I see there, why don't we're getting a little tight on time here. I would appreciate just a few minute break so I can get a little bit more water and get ready for the next half. And we can continue with questions in the second half. How does that sound, Etienne?
Sounds great. When are we
Perfect.
coming back, Christina?
I would say let's give at least 5 minutes to give a chance to stretch out and use the bathroom. So come back at 11:26.
Okay,
All right.
sounds good. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks.
Here we go. Okay. So I'm gonna do this in presenter view. Okay. So we are going to focus now on the After the Storm manual, and have some discussion and questions at the end as well. But this kind of walks you through the principles we use on the modifiable risk factors to help children cope with the aftermath of disasters. So the way I've got this organized is and just tell you a few words about the manual. Oh, I've already described it a little bit. And then we're going to go through the content. So for those of you who are on the call, if you have the manual with you, that may be really helpful because I have some illustrations on the slides, but it's really easier to see it if you've got it in person. I'm going to kind of walk you through it. We're going to review the manual content, and then there's some time for general discussion. So, I mean, just at first, in terms of introduction, as I mentioned earlier, there was originally a Helping America Cope, but we now have After the Storm and Helping Children Cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of these materials are free and available anytime from either my faculty website or from serendipity.com. But they were basically designed for a parent or a caring adult to do with a child, but they can be adapted for classroom use or for use by counselors. We've done training in Puerto Rico, for example, after Hurricane Maria, to train the trainers on how to use these principles with the children or families they're working with. And it's been disseminated in the Gulf Coast. We have a SAMHSA grant now to disseminate this in the state of Louisiana, which was affected by 6 hurricanes in 2020. Oops, here we go. So yeah, this is the brief history of it. We developed it originally. We've distributed many copies of it. So let me move on from this slide here. So the way the book is organized, there are 16 topics that are covered, and it's really up to the user to select which activities you want to use. It doesn't have to be used in the order in which we have them in the manual. And the activities are designed basically for elementary school age kids, but they can be used with older or younger children as well. For example, younger children could complete some of the activities by drawing rather than writing. You can modify them if you're working with younger children or older children. Now, the way it's organized through most of the manual, on the left side is what we call the adult page, which provides instructions for the adults, sometimes an adult activity, or even a joint activity for the adult to do with the child. And on the right side, we have child pages that contain parallel information and activities. And in addition to these pages, we have, in addition to the manual, we also have an educator supplement available. So if any of you are interested in that, just let me know, and I can send it to, we'll figure out a way of getting it to you. So in terms of the overview of that manual, all of the activities in there are evidence-based. So they're based on what we know about things that cause stress and how to modify stress. And the main goals of the manual are to really enhance social support and communication. We didn't initially build in a social support lesson in this because the idea of it was by having a parent or a caring adult work with a child individually and do these activities together, it would build social support between them. And so that it's meant to enhance social support and communication, help parents identify stress reactions in children and what are adaptive ways of coping with them, and also then to promote adaptive coping and prevent future problems. So we've got 5 sections to the book. The first couple are information activities to help ease into using this manual. And then the next set are helping you understand children's reactions to hurricanes, followed by the universal strategies that help most children cope, and then coping skills for children with specific situations. These are the kids that are continuing to show anxiety or depression or anger. And then there's some resources at the end that may be useful for creating a disaster plan and answer to some common questions we found parents have. So this is what the table, if you turn to your table of contents, this is what it looks like. So we're going to walk through each of these topics that fall, briefly walk through each of these topics that fall within the main concepts of the book. The one other thing I would say before using the book is that it's important to look at it first and evaluate if you're using this with children, to evaluate your own stress levels. You know, adults model anxiety, stress, other things that children pick up on. So it'll be more effective if the people using the book are comfortable with themselves before they work on the activities with children. And I mentioned that can be adapted activities for different age groups. But I think our most important tip is to select the things that help most children and then use special situations as the need arises. So first we have the introductory section, which really is focused on what is a hurricane and understanding what hurricanes are. So, you know, there's in the understanding hurricanes, there's this is now on pages, if you have your manual, pages 4 to 7 of the manual. I have my manual right here. It's basically a science lesson so that children can understand events accurately. So children often have a lot of misconceptions about things. And so to try and help them understand what is a hurricane and understand, you know, it may help them to understand their reactions and feelings to the storm and its aftermath. So it gives some joint activity for a parent and child to work on, is identifying some terms that are commonly used in the hurricane area, having children draw or write about what they saw. And then there's also a hurricane detective activity, which is on page 7 of your manual. So like it gives the child a task to do. So to find out, like, well, when was the hurricane? You basically are making the child the meteorologist who's reporting on the hurricane. And this is kind of maybe a more fun way to get children to learn about the different parameters of a hurricane. So the next thing that comes up in the next section of the book which is an important section, is to help how you can understand children's reactions and how you can keep the lines of communication open with them. And so there are 3 main sections in this part of the book. One is on children's feelings, so that the parent or caring adult can understand how a child is feeling and also gives them tips for how to talk to the child. Then there's understanding children's stress reactions, so that you can identify what are their current reactions to the events, and also give parents or a caring adult a little more information about knowing who's at risk. And then the 5th topic is understanding how children cope and focusing on the positive and avoiding the negative kinds of poor emotion and regulation strategies. So like now this is more on page, start off with understanding how kids feel. So this is like pages basically 8 and 9 of the manual. And page 9 has a bunch of faces on it. But what it advises the parent or adult to do is to examine your feelings about the hurricane right afterwards and now, so that you have, like, it cues you to do that, so that you know whether you're in good shape to do this kind of activity with a child. And then for children, the child is on the child page, children circle the faces to show how they felt during and right after the storm. And then there's also a place for them you can always use more paper, but to draw or write about their reactions. This is trying to open up the lines of communication. On the next page, there are tips for talking to children. So parents during the hurricane or after the hurricane, you know, may have a hard time knowing how to approach the topic with their child. And so it gives the parents some tips on what to do. To first of all, to listen to the child's feelings and to validate them by saying, you know, I understand how you feel, or I see you're feeling, you know, whatever, repeating back what the child is telling them, to acknowledge that. Many of you who are psychologists and social workers already know these tips on talking to children, but a parent may need a little bit more help, like to acknowledging and normalize the statements, like, it sounds like you were scared. It's a lot of people felt that way. That's a really important, the normalization, recognition and normalization is really important for kids to be heard. Being neutral, remembering that it's okay to say, I don't know, expressing your own feelings carefully so that it doesn't really scare a child. But, you know, if you share, yeah, I feel sad about that too, you know, it's something I wish hadn't happened. I think it's sharing the feelings can also help to open up communication. And then paying attention to behaviors that children show that they're having strong feelings, like are they fidgeting? Are they avoiding eye contact? What is their body language like? These are tips for the adult or the person who's working with the child on feelings. And there's also one activity you could use with a child to prompt them to express their feelings is like a what we call the sentence completion activity, where there are a bunch of open-ended sentences and then children can just put in what they feel. So that's the way to prompt the children and to talk and to open up communication with them. And then there's another, chapter 4 is really on understanding what the children's specific stress reactions are. And so what symptoms are they experiencing? And then how can you redirect them to different activities in the book that can be helpful for them? So for example, on page 12, on page 13, there's this measure of post-traumatic stress symptoms. I have just part of it here, but you can see the full measure on page 13 of your manual. And basically it covers all the key symptoms that you see in kids' stress reactions, which I've listed here on the left. Things like re-experiencing the event, which is I keep thinking about what happened, or I think about the hurricane even when I don't want to. And it has got examples of avoidance and numbing. It's got examples of fears and worries, and it's got examples of sleep difficulties as well. And so on the page before this is like a key for parents to interpret what the child puts in their questionnaire on how I have been feeling. So if a child answered item number 5 and 14, that suggests they have a lot of fear and worry. So for example, number 5 is, I worry that another hurricane or something bad might happen. 14 is, I worry about things that didn't bother me before, like being away from my family. So this is basically the answer key for parents to interpret the kinds of stress reactions their children are reporting and to point them to the section of the book that may be most useful for them to try out with their child, or a counselor working with a child, or a teacher working with a group of kids. So then we have information for the parent. If you move then on to page, let me see. Now I'm getting this. Pages. There's another page that has the parents, the risk for who's at risk is on page 12, I guess, of the manual. What children are most at risk? So the book moves on to identifying stress reactions. And then for the adult, there's a list of risk. It's on page 14, a list of risk factors for stress reactions, both during and after the hurricane. And on the following page, which is and these are the at-risk cues here. I'm sorry, I have it at page 12, but it's actually on page 14. On page 15, though, you also have a gauge, which this is the child activity. So the child can fill out, color up the rain gauge. It's like the more rain, the more you fill it up. That's the concept of it. So a child can give the parent or the caring adult or the counselor an idea of how stressed they are. And so this is an activity that the parent or counselor can build on. And then part of this activity is, if the child is really stressed, maybe what you want to do is try and balance risks with social support or other resources that the child has. I don't know about our time. I don't know if we may have a few minutes that we could try this. We only have 20 minutes. Okay. Maybe we won't try this activity out, but the idea, and you could do this with a group of kids too. It's actually even a great classroom activity, but you can have, like, especially if you've got a little balancing beam, you can have the children say, okay, what are some of the stressors that you're feeling? And you can fill up the stressor side, but then they have to come up with things that resources that they can balance it off to help get it to balance the balancing beam. So the supports could be, I could call a friend and talk to my friend, or I can watch my favorite TV show or read a book, or things that they would find as helping, or I can practice relaxation. But you have to get the child and the parent to kind of come up with what are going to be those resources or supports so they can help balance the stress out. And that can be a very fun activity to do with a child. Okay, the next section is on, part of this overall section is on, topic area is on understanding how kids cope, because you want to get them to focus on the positive coping and avoid the negative coping. And the manual has some positive coping strategies that you can direct the child towards and away from the things that are going to get children in trouble or reflect more poor emotion regulation. So that's that section of the book. Understanding kids' feelings, understanding how stressed they are, trying to key into positive coping. Now we get to the section of the book, number 3, which is things that help most children cope. So these are the universal strategies that can be useful. And they include things like maintaining a normal routine, reducing media exposure to traumatic aspects of the disaster, staying healthy and fit, helping others and giving thanks. And we're going to just take these one by one here. So first, on maintaining normal routines, you can see in your manual, there's a child activity where you get the child to make or illustrate what their normal routine is every day. What do they do in the morning? What do they do in the afternoon? What do they do in the evening? And then to maybe complete the clock, though I don't know, somebody suggested we should maybe be moving to digital clocks these days rather than the old-fashioned clocks, but I still think children understand the clock concept. But the idea is to make, after a disaster, lives are really disrupted and children feel much more secure if they have a normal routine. And then you may have to periodically change the routine as circumstances change, but having a normal routine will help children feel more secure. In fact, after Hurricane Andrew, a lot of the kids told us that they loved being in school. They hated going home because in school, they felt like things were normal. They had a routine. They saw their friends. They could forget about the hurricane. When they got home and their home was a mess, or there was still a lot of debris around in their neighborhood, it was still distressing to them. But it hammered home how schools are often a source of normalcy, and having a normal routine in school. You're on a routine. You have a set schedule. So making that a part of children's recovery can be very important. So the second activity in this section of the book is on reducing exposure to the media, especially the media news, which shows a lot of trauma and disaster kinds of related things. And I think this is important before as well as during as well as after an event. So on the adult page, there's an activity for adults because they often can control what children are viewing and their exposure to TV, their exposure to the internet via maybe a computer or other smartphone and things at home. But parents should be encouraged to develop their own guide for TV and internet use, but particularly by limiting kids' exposure to this. And if the child is watching or doing some things, for them to view it with them if they can even. I'd encourage their child to participate in other activities that can be less stressful and maybe more productive. And on the child page, the child has to identify what some of those activities could be. Would they like to listen to music, play with friends, do family activities? So there's some things for them to identify, things that they like to do, but that they can do some of these things together with friends or family would be especially useful. The third section in here is staying healthy and fit. As I mentioned, that's a great way to manage stress more effectively. And so there's a joint activity where the parent and child together figure out what they can do to help the child eat better, or for a child who has trouble staying or falling asleep, what they can do to promote better sleep hygiene, what they can do for exercise, and also for any kind of physical complaints or somatic complaints the child may have. So that's a joint activity on the parent page. But on the child page, there's also a form. This is on page 23 of your manual, where the child first fills in some of their favorite foods, their favorite way to relax. And then the parent incorporates that in the plan, the healthy plan for the child. And then the fourth topic in this section is on helping others and giving thanks. And this is something that could relate, back again to the community. So there are we find that children and adults who do volunteer work, who spend time with the community, that also helps them reduce their own levels of stress. So there are some suggestions for how that might take place, or for parents to help with their child identify how those things could take place. And also getting children to write every day or periodically what they're thankful for. Expressing thanks can also be another way of focusing on the positive and helping them move beyond the disaster into a recovery mode. So you can find these activities on pages 24 and 25 of your manuals. If you're working with kids in a group situation, then you can one great way to start off a group or a class might be to even just start by sharing one thing you're thankful for every day, and then one at a time go around and ask each kid to do the same. That seems to be a really great way to warm up a class or a group, or a great way to start an activity. Now, in our hurricane manual, we didn't have a chapter for social connectedness, but that's also important. And in our next iteration of the book, we'll include that. We have it in the COVID manual, but I think highlighting it even beyond just the parent and child support would be important, because children also get a lot of support from their friends. So, and their friendship relationships are often very disrupted after a disaster, especially if they have to move or their friends have to move. So trying to find ways for them to stay socially connected is also critical. So that's section 3 of the book. Section 4 is now strategies for dealing with special situations. These may not apply to every child. These may apply to kids who have like fears and worries, intrusive thoughts and dreams, which is a common, and that's sort of like what you mentioned a little bit earlier, Don, with the repetitive negative thinking or ruminating. Some kids have intrusive thoughts and dreams, and that makes it hard for them to sleep, or they may have angry feelings, or they may be coping with sadness and loss. They also just in general may need to cope with change, because there are a lot of changes that go along with these events. And so there's a child activity for parents to work with, for a child to complete, and then a joint activity which focuses on identifying what are some of the changes that the child has seen, and particularly if they can identify positive changes. This is related to what we call post-traumatic growth, where although a really horrible thing has happened, sometimes some good changes can come about. And it may be feeling more of a sense of community, or maybe some things that, or activities that parents and children or others can do together. But anyway, and this is again something that lends itself to a group activity. If you are working with children's in groups, by having everybody share one positive change, and mixing this up a little bit after each at other group meetings, you can focus on changes at home, changes in the community, changes with friends, perhaps. So then the other sections deal with fears and worries. So, for example, there are many things in here for fears and worries. One of them is on page 30 to help a joint activity with parents or adults and kids to develop a worry buster plan. So like one kid, a common thing after a hurricane is kids are worried that maybe even another hurricane might hit. I mean, they may not be out of hurricane season, and it's not out of the realm of possibility. But the idea is to work with the child, maybe using an index card or a piece of paper, to figure out what are going to be the worry buster activities. What's going to help them not feel that worried about another hurricane hitting. And the manual also gives parents some strategies that they could suggest children use. Like if they're worried about something, maybe to find a practical solution, to talk to somebody about it. If they're afraid when there's a storm or something, to gradually face their fears. That's one of the ways that you conquer fear, is to gradually face it in a safe environment. The next section focuses on intrusive thoughts and dreams. And this is way like this often kids have bad dreams or can't stop thinking about something before bedtime. It also often interferes with their sleep. So there's some activities there for parents and children to work on to try and counteract these kinds of intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts and bad dreams and trouble sleeping are probably one of are the most common kinds of symptoms you see in kids when they're very stressed out. And then finally, the section on coping with angry feelings. Here, the idea is to let children understand that it's okay to feel angry, but it's not okay to take it out on others. So the strategy here is to develop a constructive way to deal with their anger. One of them is sort of a relaxation strategy by taking a breath and thinking about things. Another way I might phrase this is like strike while the iron is cold. Like if you want to, if you're really angry, wait till you calm down before doing anything about it. And then the last section here is on sadness and loss. And I would say a lot of parents are completely unaware of how sad their children are after these events. I remember when we first did the first manual, the Helping America Cope After 9/11, we tried it out with some kids before we finalized the activities. And one of the parents and kids, and one of the parents asked her kids, what they lost because of the events of 9/11. And their son, who was 11 at the time, said, "I lost my happiness." A parent never was expecting something like that. It's amazing what kids will come up with when you ask them about how they're feeling. And sometimes it's hard to observe feelings of sadness and loss. And so this activity might help a parent to understand that a little bit better in their kids, and also focuses on some of the signs of depression that they may need to be paying attention to see if their child may even need more help in that area. And then finally, the last part of the manual, I know we're almost out of time. This is the last part I have to say, is additional information and resources. For example, there's information on how to develop a family disaster plan. And then there's also some information on relaxation, how to help your child relax, and other websites and resources that a parent or a mental health worker can find useful to helping the children cope with the events. So, I mean, that's all I have to say about the manual at this point, but maybe we can open things up for discussion. How can you apply these concepts to the, one thing I would be interested in hearing is how you can apply these concepts or strategies in the work that you do. And also if you want to pop a question into the chat, I'm going to do this stop share here and maybe we can go to the chat part. So comments, questions, how can you use these? I see a couple of questions in here. Okay, so until people speak up or add to the chat, let me say, so Nancy, thank you again for your comment. As a community leader, I'm wondering if there's data from children and youth who have endured multiple events. That's a great question. After the storm, I'm just reading through the rest of it. It's a hurricane season, so it seems preparation and recovery are cyclical, not linear. And is there data from adults, children, others from working through after the storm every several months? That's a great question. I have to say one of our frustrations is trying to get people to provide us with systematic feedback on after the storm. I mean, I think people find it useful. I mean, I guess what people have told us, this is what we've heard from parents. They find it useful because they can go through the manual at their own pace. They can use whatever lessons they think are helpful for their child. They like that it focuses on mental health and provides easy to understand mental health concepts, because actually a lot of parents tell us that they were completely surprised at how traumatized their kids were. And maybe they would have even done preparation differently had they known how scary these kind of events could be. And so the parents are, in our experience, at least the parents seem to pick and choose among the activities and use the ones that seem to be more relevant for their own children. So yeah, I think we don't really have any good data on the cyclical patterns, and I think that would be a great thing to take a look at. Um, what happens in Florida, like, so this year there was Hurricane Ian. So I'm sure people on the west coast of Florida are very sensitized to hurricanes right now. And maybe even people a little bit on the East Coast because of Hurricane Nicole, even though at least here in Miami area, it kind of missed people. But then if you go a few years without anything happening, people kind of get immune to these events and may not recall even what they did, several years ago. Like I guess now Hurricane Irma is now already 5 years. If you're a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, you probably don't even remember Hurricane Irma and what happened then, but the parents will. And I think that the point about understanding the cyclical process is really a critical one. Now, when we do hurricane studies, we ask about people's prior experiences so that we can go back and take a look at that. But I think we're now getting more and more people who've had some experience with, unfortunately, more experience with disasters.
Annette,
Yeah.
I have a question for you. You mentioned in the first half of your presentation that the mental health assessment of youth ought to be done directly, with the kids and not through parents or others. Now, given the crisis that we have now in the mental health system, and in terms of providing adequate services for youth, and given the conditions that communities find themselves after a storm, do you know of places, communities that have succeeded in implementing assessment protocols of the sort that you think need to be done, or do you know of resources that people can draw from that may be helpful to them in these efforts?
That's a great question. I know after Hurricane Michael in Bay County, Florida, what their school system decided to do was do a screening with most of the kids in the Bay County schools. And what they did was administer a few brief questionnaires to kids just to get an idea of how kids were doing. And actually that pie chart I showed you was some of the data from that particular assessment. I think schools are a natural place to do sort of a screening just for those kinds of things. But the problem is, if you're doing a screening, you have to also have mental health resources in place. And it's really hard. It's really hard after these large scale events when there are many people affected and there are limited mental health resources to know how to provide care. But that's where they've used the after the storm manual, and a lot of the school counselors there built on the activities that we had in the manual. And we had, I'm happy to share the educator supplement. Some of the teachers incorporated some of the activities into the classroom. But I think the point of the assessment is, if you just ask teachers how kids are doing, or you just ask parents, you're probably going to get a really, unfortunately, an underestimate of how kids may be struggling. So if there's a way of doing a general screening in the schools, and it doesn't have to be done immediately, it could be done like a couple of months. Like for Hurricane Ian, I would say I'd probably wait on a screening until like 3 months after the disaster or more, because initially everybody's distressed. I mean, unfortunately, that's common and normal under these circumstances. But now it's September, October, November, December. We're almost 3 months. Pretty soon we'll be 3 months after Hurricane Ian. I think I would consider, if I was working in the schools in those areas, maybe in January or February, just doing a touch-based screening to see how the kids are doing, or 6 months after it even. Because by 6 months, if kids are still experiencing a lot of distress, you want to try and do something within the school system or within the community to help provide maybe group services or activities that could be done in a classroom, just to help children get focusing more on positive coping, for example, or any of those things that help most kids could be used in situations like that.
Oh, thanks, Annette. I think that's very, very helpful. Dawn, I wanted to have an opportunity also for our scientific director, Dawn Meichenbaum, to comment.
Well, Annette, I think you're a pioneer in this field. And this was a great presentation. One thing that I would add, since you mentioned it, is George Bonanno wrote a book called The End of Trauma. And it's all about the role that resilience plays. And I recommend it very highly as compared to Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps Score. You know, it conveys hope and the notion of flexibility. So if you're in this area, that's become my Bible.
Sounds good. George is great. I know George personally, and he's really a good thinker in this area.
Very good.
Thank you. Well, I think we're just about out of time, and actually I have another appointment I'm going to have to run off to. So thank you all for paying attention for 2 hours. So and participating. I really appreciate that.
Well, Annette, we owe you the thanks for joining us today, for sharing your research, for devoting your life to this effort. And so really from the bottom of my heart, thank you for joining us today. Thanks to everybody who's been with us this morning. Remember that everything that the Melissa Institute does is done for free. And we only ask that you use the right knowledge in the right places in the right time to help others. And that if the situation allows you, that you consider donating to the Institute to help us continue to do this kind of work. I wish you all a happy holiday season, and we'll be in touch. All right?
Okay. Bye. Bye.